I'm Catherine Arndt, the Chief of the VLGA Connect Studio. Welcome to today's episode, brought to you by the VLGA, your councillor support network and the national broadcaster on all things local government.
Welcome everyone to VLGA Connect. It's the TGU panel together again to talk about this week's big local government news. And there's been few weeks bigger than this one. Hello, Tony Rownick.
Absolutely, Chris. What a week full of announcements and implications for the sector.
And hello, Julie Reid.
Hello, Chris. Yes, I'm feeling it this week. Lots of reading, lots of digesting. Wow.
Yes, can I perhaps guess that you've been reading a 309-page report that finally came out from IBAC this week into Operation Sandon. Now, for those who perhaps aren't aware, can't imagine you're not, this is the outcome of what's been a few years now of inquiries and processes related to the city of Casey and various planning matters. The outcome is not just going to affect the city of Casey, it's going to affect the whole sector. Now, can I just say up front that we're going to unpack this in great detail on a special edition of VLGA Connect that's coming next week. The heavy hitters are coming in for this one. I'm talking about Catherine Arndt, the CEO of the VLGA, and Tony Rownick will put a legal lens on this. But Tony and Julie, just in broad terms, perhaps if we can talk about your initial reactions. Julie, I might start with you as the planner in the group. What were your thoughts?
Yes, Chris. I mean, obviously there were really strong governance and planning recommendations. It's interesting that my initial thoughts were not surprised at the recommendations that came through around planning, and expected that it was going to end up in this space. What we're going to see now is this pulling away of powers from local government in the planning space as a result. So this is really significant for the sector. And I'm sure that councils around the state are looking at the document really in a lot of detail at the moment to understand what that's going to mean for them. But look, it was interesting this week. The Planning Institute of Australia put out a communication through to all the members of PIA. They have supported the government, supported the recommendations to the government. And they do believe that the government should consider ways to capture the windfall gains, and welcomes the emphasis on strategic justification in planning. You must have reasons why you want to rezone land. So that was really good. They have made a really, really strong statement about the importance of the fact that in all of this, the staff have done a job that they should have done. They've been, they've made recommendations that were valid, and they shouldn't really be criticised in this situation for what has gone on. So they're urging the Victorian government to work closely with the Planning Institute and to design and implement the planning reforms from the report in consultation with the sector. And with the planners. So, really, really strong message coming out from the Planning Institute of Australia, and rightly so. The staff in all of this have done the job they should have done.
Good to get that perspective on it up front. I do note, as you hinted, the Premier, his response pretty measured so far, but he has said there's a clear position of the government that the role of local councils in significant planning decisions should be reduced, and they'll have more to say on that. I think, Tony, interested in your take on that, of course, but also quite a few governance things wrapped up in these recommendations that perhaps we weren't expecting.
Exactly, Chris. That's sort of big takeaway for me. We sort of anticipated these planning changes, which will of course have an enormous impact on the role of council and its operations, but equally so, I think some of the governance changes in those 34 recommendations, if picked up, for example, the requirement for model transparency rules, which deal with, pre-council meetings, what's allowed in terms of discussions at council briefings. How do we run council meetings? Are there, with in terms of having standard governance rules? This no need for divisions because we're going to record everyone's vote for every resolution. The change to the misconduct sanctions such that potentially you might be a councillor who's found guilty of misconduct might be ineligible to be the mayor. The changes around CEO contracts, having a model CEO contract, a standard contract, and essentially taking the appointment, performance review, management and monitoring obligation or responsibility away from councillors, in that a majority of people on that committee, including the chair, would be independent. And I think that's big. It's a major change in terms of how the administration operates and council's role in being able to affect organisational change, but also in terms of continuity. So there's a lot here still to play out, and the detail will be really important, and that's where the task force that's in the recommendation number 1, in fact, the task force, if set up, will have an enormous role in getting into the detail of these recommendations.
So there's a lot to unpack there, and as I said, we will do that on a special episode, hopefully very early next week. Those that you mentioned, the briefing session implications, the CEO employment life cycle implications are major, and perhaps we weren't expecting those. LG Pro has come out and welcomed many of the recommendations. Some of these align with comments that LG Pro has made in its submission to the culture review. They've particularly highlighted sanctions for misconduct that are adequate and applied appropriately, explicit provisions for allowing council officers and members of the public to make complaints to the Chief Municipal Inspector, and publication of data on arbitration and complaint processes. As we said, there's so much in this. We might park it there, but I just did want to make one comment and get your
and just one
thought.
other comment from me as well, Chris.
Yeah,
sorry.
Please, you go first, Julie.
Yeah, I just wanted to make the point broadly that any changes to the Victorian planning system must put the interests of the public first, and there should be clear mechanisms for local input to planning decisions. So we can't lose sight of that, and I think it's really clear in all of this, if power is taken away, that there still needs to be that local input. That's what I'm concerned about, and I think that the Planning Institute of Australia are concerned about that as well, because planning fundamentally is committed to public interest as well.
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll hear that talked about quite a bit as these recommendations get discussed. Tony, Julie, one of the things that occurred to me in reading through all of this is we've got a reasonably new piece of legislation, the Local Government Act 2020, which was meant to be and was trumpeted as being principles-based and not prescriptive as per the old Act. Are we, if all of these get implemented, actually going back to a piece of legislation that is more prescriptive than principles-based?
100%. I think the pendulum is clearly swinging towards prescription, swinging away from the idea that councils might take an individual approach, have different policies, different provisions in terms of how meetings are run, in terms of governance rules, transparency rules, councillor codes of conduct. We're going to have a standardisation, it would seem, across the 79 councils.
Chris, and I think there will be certainly some concern and maybe some resistance from those that drafted the legislation in the first place to move into this space. But, it's going to be really interesting to see what this task force within the government comes up with, because they, at the end of the day, they may not have much choice in this space. No. They may have to go for more prescription.
And I would just make the point, Chris, these are just recommendations. So yes. It's for the government to pick up on these, and already, the message I'm hearing is they're not going to pick up on those political donations recommendations, is the sense I've got in terms of what the Premier has said yesterday, saying, Victoria's already got that covered. So we may see some walking back by government with some of these recommendations at least.
And I would make the point that most of the behaviours that are unpacked in this report occurred before the new Local Government Act ever actually came into effect. So let's keep that in perspective as well. All right, promise to come back to that on our special episode next week, and I'm sure Catherine, the CEO of the VLGA, will have a take on all of that as well. Lots of other things happening this week. Another long-running matter has reached one point of conclusion. That is the case of iCook Foods versus Greater Dandenong City Council. It's been referred to, and I hate the term, as Sluggate for quite some time. The matter between the council and iCook Foods is now concluded. The case was dropped after a court-ordered mediation, which I'm sure has been welcomed within the Greater Dandenong City Council. Big effects on staff here over a long period of time. Tony, your take?
Yeah, as you say, the outcome of that mediation held on the 25th of July was that a settlement, both parties are bearing their own legal costs. There's no payment from Greater Dandenong City Council to iCook Proprietary Limited, according to the statement on Dandenong's website. So I guess this would be heartening for those council officers, both current and former, that were, part of the allegations or the material that was put forward by iCook Foods, in that it would seem, at least in relation to these proceedings, the outcome is that there's not only nothing adverse and no compensation or payment by council. Would seem the council's been vindicated through this set of proceedings, at least.
That's certainly the tone of the statement that's come from the CEO, Jackie Weatherall, of course, who's come into the role partway through all of this. Would just make the point that this whole matter is not completely finished. There is a court action, I think, that's happening next week, and Professor Brett Sutton, the former Chief Health Officer, is, I think, the only witness in that matter. So insiders tell me that that's perhaps not going to take a long time to play out as well. So the next piece of the puzzle, we'll know how that looks like fitting in soon.
Chris, I think it's really great to see this coming to a closure. There's a lot of people at Greater Dandenong that have enormous amounts of integrity and have gone through enormous amounts of stress during this time on this case. And it's really great to see the outcome today that has really gone in favour of the city of Greater Dandenong. It will be interesting to see what comes out next week, but very pleased to see, we'll be very pleased to see the back of this one.
All right. Tony, we recently talked about an arbiter's report at Golden Plains involving Councillor Les Rowe. There's been a second one, and this one sort of upped the ante a bit, because Councillor Rowe is now on a 1-month suspension, and I note has requested and been granted a leave of absence that backs on to that. So he'll be away from council now until October. So this was over a different matter than the previous one we discussed.
Yeah, that's right. So previously we discussed comments in relation to directed towards the CEO in an email that was CC'd to all councillors that were regarded as misconduct or inappropriate comments towards the CEO that the councillor tried to explain away as his blunt farmer manner. Well, in this case, we're dealing with comments the same councillor, Councillor Les Rowe, made to a reporter. The Golden Plains Times is a publication, and the comments were critical of council's road grading program. And they were reported in an article in January in that newspaper. And various staff in the council's grading and outdoors team were quite upset by these comments, some of them visibly upset. And Mr. Rowe, Councillor Rowe, had refused to apologise. Had said, I didn't intend to criticise staff. That wasn't my intent, so I'm not going to apologise, which the arbiter, someone well known in local government circles, Yehudi Blasher, he said, well, that's a curious argument. It's not just what you intend, it's the reasonable effect of your words. Interestingly, Councillor Rowe had not passed on what he said were complaints from members of the public about the road grading program. He hadn't passed them on to the council administration, council officers. And the arbiter found that it was misconduct, that an apology was required to be made in writing. The apology needed to acknowledge the relevant council staff were upset, were insulted, felt left down. And more than that, Councillor Rowe has had to undertake that in future, any operational matters that were brought to his attention would be passed on to the CEO or to relevant staff. So,
and not via the media.
Not via the media.
Yeah.
There's a second element to this decision, I can just say, that I think's important and will have CEOs sort of rushing to their policies and looking, and that is an element of the allegation that wasn't upheld was that that there was a breach of the council's media policy. And the media policy said that media comments should, and should's the critical word here, should be coordinated through the senior communications marketing officer. And the use of the word should rather than must was seen as material by the arbiter, and said, well, it wasn't mandatory because the word should rather than must was used. So for CEOs, councillors who think that their policies ought to be mandatory, they'll be going to those policies and looking to see, do they use language like should, or do they use more directive type language like must?
And Tony, did I read correctly that there was an intention that it would be a must or something that's more definitive, but that change hadn't been formally incorporated into the policy?
I didn't pick that up. It may well be, but if that's the case, well, even more sort of underlines the need for us in the sector, but to be going through these policies and making sure the correct language is used.
Yeah, look, Chris, interesting, and I think a really good decision by Yehudi Blasher in this case. It was interesting to see that extra bit of not getting involved in the operations. I was really pleased to see that. My question to Tony would be, if that gets breached at any one time or any time, what will then happen? Does that then mean that they're breaching the arbiter's direction? And what action can then be taken against the councillor in relation to that? So that's really interesting from that point of view, and probably the first case I think we've seen that it's had that kind of a direction around the getting involved in the operations. Is that correct, Tony?
Yeah, well, I think what I found really interesting along those terms was that in this arbiter decision, the arbiter actually reflected on the prior arbiter decision by Louise Hill. So if you like, there was that element of, there's a cumulative impact here. This is the second occasion where you doubled down and refused to apologise. Clearly, I need to make sure that it's more than just an apology. I need to be more directive in terms of what you undertake to do. I think in terms of failure to follow the arbiter's determination, the determination was that you need to make an apology and you need to make this undertaking. So given that that's been done, and that I've seen it in the tabled decision, the council minutes, a handwritten letter from the councillor to the staff in question. Arguably, he's gone ahead and done what he was required to do. But I think it does mean councillors who have form, if I can put it that colloquially, seems to be being taken into account at the time an arbiter's decision was made. There's a context that's being considered.
So I don't want to labour this too much, and certainly don't want to present a case for the prosecution here, Tony, but the arbiter said that the written apology must be limited to the following, and provided a couple of dot points. The written apology, handwritten as you say, goes further than that. And there's some qualifying comments in there that made me wonder, Has this written apology actually complied with the arbiter's decision?
That occurred to me. It's certainly when the written apology had paragraphs that went to, what I'll continue to do as a councillor and what I've done in the past, and which were sort of extraneous, if you like, or certainly weren't part of the arbiter's order or determination. So it'll be interesting what attitude perhaps that the Councillor Conduct Panel Registrar takes to that.
Yep. All right. Let's leave that one there. Interesting reading, though, if you like to follow these cases, as I know many of you do. And these are instructive for councillors and for CEOs and officers right across the sector, aren't they? We talk about these not to embarrass anyone or, create a problem for anyone, but certainly as a learning opportunity, I think, more broadly. Another councillor resignation this week at Strathbogie Shire. This is the third one in this term of the council, and we remind you this is the council that has a second monitor in place as we speak, with a term due to expire, I think, next month. This one's from Seven Creeks Ward. Christy Hourigan has stepped down. The interesting thing here, Tony, is the statement that the former councillor has made, calling out gender bias and in-house political bureaucracy as clearly being the motivating factor in stepping aside.
Yeah, I did see that. Look, of course, people make all sorts of statements when they leave an organisation, often or sometimes critical of the place that they're leaving. And I don't know the facts that apply here. As you say, there's a monitor at Strathbogie, so presumably in the next round of monitor report might well reflect on the situation there and what the monitor's observations are. But lightning doesn't often strike in the same spot. It's struck 3 times in Strathbogie. I'm not saying that determines an outcome, but clearly 3 councillors have decided that it wasn't right for them to stay on as councillors and have departed.
Yeah. So no word yet on a process to fill that position. But Julie, before you ask, 47.
47. Look, Chris, if I can just make a comment, what really kind of worried me about the statement that was made by Miss Hourigan was that she said that the role of the councillor is a thankless task, which is worrying in that respect, that people are seeing it in that way. And what does that mean? What's going on in that community that means that, she feels that she can no longer, act in that role. But
because you're right. She made the point not just within the council, but beyond as well, the inference being the community.
Yeah. And then she also talks about she's hoping that the council will create this respectful and inclusive environment, and that worries me. She wants all voices to be heard and to address concerns. So there are obviously some issues there. No doubt that's going to come through in the monitor's reporting back to the minister. But what does this mean for Strathbogie going forward?
Yeah.
There's obviously some issues there that need to be ironed out, and I suspect the government are looking at this very carefully at the moment.
I'm sure they would. 3 is a lot in one term, and with just a little over 12 months to go till the next election, I guess there's a lot of factors that'll need to be taken into account in terms of what response, if any, might be coming. Okay, that's Strathbogie. Down to Surf Coast Shire. It's been getting a bit of attention this week for a decision to amend its community amenity local law, which effectively means that all Shire bathrooms will be gender neutral from this point on. Tony, are we aware of this happening in a regional area as yet, or is this a first, do you think?
We'd all be familiar, of course, with like unisex toilets, which are so signed as unisex. What we're actually talking about here, if I understand it right, is no change to the signage. So we'd still see that, typically the women's toilets, the men's toilets is often what the sign says or the image projects. But anyone over the age of 6 is entitled to use whichever bathroom they choose. So effectively, I could use a bathroom that was labelled women's or had the the picture of a female on the outside. So I think there's some I think there's some major safety issues here. I must admit I haven't read the officer's report, but I think not all people in society, people in society might take some advantage of this. I've got a few reservations, I've got to say.
And it was those sort of issues, I think, that led to quite a number of submissions against the proposal and a petition, if I recall correctly, that might have had 500 signatures or more. So the council's weighed all of that up in making its decision and landed on removing that clause from the local law. An emotive issue, Julie, for some.
Yeah, it is, Chris. And, I've seen these kind of debates play out in council chambers, and, female views versus male views on this are sometimes very, very different. So, look, I think this is certainly interesting in terms of them having the courage to try this and see how it goes. They've obviously been under a lot of criticism around it, and I would have expected that. I don't know whether or not our communities are ready for this yet. But anyway, look, I think hats off to them. I think it's great that they're trying something different. I think it's a really good test of how the community going forward will accept this kind of approach towards delivery of services by councils.
Yeah. Okay, so that's Surf Coast Shire. More generally, we talked to Tony with the cancellation of the Regional Victorian Commonwealth Games. Those councils that perhaps weren't in the regional hubs but had made commitments based on the expected outcomes of the games. I'm not saying it's because we raised it here, but certainly there's news now of a compensation package for councils that goes to the regional hubs, but a little bit beyond as well.
Yeah, 2 million for those other councils that are beyond those regional hubs, 5 million each for Latrobe, Ballarat, Bendigo, Geelong, and another 3 million for Shepparton. So, and this is to cover those costs of the resourcing up that occurred at those places, particularly the hub councils, where there were senior officer appointments, rightly so, in relation to preparing for the Commonwealth Games, and those officers are still employed. They're on employment contracts. There are obligations to pay them, and they're presumably being redeployed, maybe in some of the expenditure of this money, and making decisions about the capital works programs that were to be associated with the Commonwealth Games. So look, I think this is a good something we'd hail from the government. We thank them for, and I'm sure that those regional councils will welcome very much, and hopefully it makes a significant difference in those non-hub communities. I'm not sure how far the 2 million will go, and I guess we'll hear about that over time.
So this was reported in The Age this week. I haven't seen too much more on it, but the slant of that story was very much about picking up the costs of senior executive roles that have been created expressly for the purpose of delivering the games on behalf of those councils. Because, Julie, some of those were like 4 or 5 year contracts, weren't they? So, it's good to know that the ratepayers aren't bearing the cost of that cancellation in that sense, but also those councils have a resource now to redeploy in some way, which would make perhaps for some interesting conversations with those individuals.
Exactly, yes. And I was really pleased to see this, and I think it will help those councils that obviously have, challenges around financial sustainability going forward. So, look, it hopefully now they can use those people to help deliver other critical services that need to be delivered across the council area.
Okay, let's look at a couple of stories from interstate, a couple of extraordinary stories that have come out this week. I want to start with in Tasmania, where Dorset Council has been subject of an investigation by the Director of Local Government. I assume that's the equivalent of an LGV or a chief municipal inspector or something like that here in Victoria. It's found allegations of systematic and widespread statutory non-compliance and failings of good governance. This has led to the Minister for Local Government appointing a two-person board of inquiry to formally investigate those allegations. And Nick Street's his name, the Minister. He's asked the councillors at Dorset to respond by the end of business today, Friday, the 28th of July, as to why they shouldn't be suspended. And the implication is that he's likely to suspend those councillors next week. That's pretty big for any council, Tony.
Yeah, absolutely. And this, of course, is triggered not just by complaints from the public, but apparently by some complaints from some of the councillors themselves. Things, as you say, like mismanagement of conflicts of interest, a lack of respect for members of the community, poor decision-making and improper use of statutory powers are some of the allegations or complaints, at least, that have been put against Dorset Council. And it'd be interesting to see the minister's response to this show cause, if you like, letter and the material that is sent to the minister and what the minister decides to do in the weeks ahead. But it would seem that, you know, a major decision potentially about the removal of those councillors is on the cards.
And interesting timing, given the review that's taking place of the sector. Forced amalgamations off the table, as we've discussed, but a major report coming out in the next couple of months looking at the way forward for a state that's got just 29 councils for, what did we say, about 600,000 people. In the Northern Territory, a serious story here. I do feel for the staff and the community at West Arnhem Regional Council. The CEO's been stood down there, in fact, terminated according to media reports. This has arisen due to allegations that the CEO and a number of staff, senior level as I understand it, took alcohol into a dry community, not for distribution, for personal consumption, but broke the rules, being investigated by Northern Territory Police, and the council has gotten together in a confidential session and terminated the employment of the CEO. Pretty serious action to take, Tony.
Yeah, it is. So we're talking about West Arnhem Regional Council, and look, these, you know, dry laws, as they're called, are treated very seriously in these communities. And of course, you know, if it was proven that someone in such a responsible role had not abided by these laws, then I can understand that would be, you know, taken quite seriously. And council has acted to remove the CEO from his position, and no doubt there'll be other processes in terms of potentially criminal matters or not. But yeah, council has acted swiftly and I think decisively here.
So the police have said they'll issue 8 infringement notices. I'm not sure if that's occurred yet. The inference here, and I've had some mail from people who understand the Northern Territory system a bit better, is that senior people are in that group. At least one unconfirmed report has resigned over all of this. I think an interesting clue as to the seriousness of this is that the person who's been put in as the acting CEO for 3 months has only been at the council for a few months, and this time last year was an executive assistant to a CEO at the City of Palmerston. So nobody in that senior level has been tapped to sit in as acting CEO. It sounds like a crisis to me.
It's suggestive of you know, a number of those other senior people potentially being involved, isn't it? But yeah, it's I like you, I'm not particularly familiar with how these laws are enforced. But yeah, as I say, it seems to be a really decisive message being sent by the councillors, at least.
It does. All right. The only other thought that crosses my mind there is the impact, Julie, on the staff in that organisation. This must be just such a tumultuous time to be trying to get on and do your job.
Oh, absolutely, Chris. And, you know, they would be concerned about the reputation of the council in all of this, and concerned that, behaviour has not been probably at the point in which the staff would expect from their superior officers. So, look, it's really hard to know which way this will go in law, but there's a hit and an impact on the council itself and the staff.
The other interstate story that intrigues me is out of Newcastle this week, where it's emerged through the media that a serial letter to the editor-writer may have very close links with the CEO of Newcastle Council. And there's no denying that the two know each other, but there are denials that there's any connection with the letters that have been sent over a long period of time to the local press. One of the local MPs, who's been described as a target of those letters, has called for an independent investigation, and it seems the New South Wales local government minister agrees and has called on the Mayor of Newcastle to look into this matter. I don't know about you, Julie or Tony. I've been in a situation where you've got a local letter writer and you wonder at times, where are they getting their information from? Sometimes, does that person actually exist, or is it a nom de plume? I think that's why I find this story so fascinating.
It's almost like an episode of Utopia, isn't it? Where did they get that information from?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Interesting.
It's all,
Tony?
Absolutely. I can empathise with the situation, but it's all very circumstantial at this stage, isn't it?
Yeah.
Someone happens to know someone who happens to be writing letters. Does that mean there's a flow of information that feeds those letters? Potentially, but not necessarily. And so where's that evidentiary trail at the moment? It's circumstantial, and I guess that's for the investigation, if it goes ahead, to uncover.
I think I read that the letter writer doesn't actually even live in the city of Newcastle, but I did read that the CEO has very clearly said he's never asked this person to write letters, and the person has said via email to the paper that the CEO has never asked him to write any letters. But let's see where that one lands. It's time for the picks of the week. Julie, what are you going to settle for this week?
Well, Chris, I'm focusing on the UK again this week, and the Local Government Association have come out with a statement that they're quite disappointed in relation to the legislation around extended producer responsibility for packaging of goods in the UK. So what it is, I think that they're trying to decrease the amount of packaging that's used for products, particularly fresh food in the UK, because of the waste challenges in the UK that is so huge. And a lot of that packaging is actually unrecyclable. So major impact on landfill. So they've said that apparently the implementation of this has been delayed for yet another 12 months. And they're really disappointed that the fact that it hasn't come about sooner. Because another 12 months of councils dealing with this enormous issue of this packaging around fresh produce. So a bit of a blow to the sector, Chris.
Yes, absolutely. But it is good to, Julie, have a UK story that you picked that is not about a council being in financial trouble, for a change.
Yes, that's right. I was trying to have a bit of a different spin on this week.
Mind you, there's no shortage of those. There's been more in the past week too. It really is on a precipice. It feels the sector in the UK at the moment. Tony, your pick of the week, good old Facebook and the intersection with councillors.
Yeah, how many times have we spoken about social media and councillor conduct matters? We only had a penny, as they say, for every time, but this time we go across the Nullarbor to Perth and the city of Bayswater and the town of Cambridge, two municipalities in Perth. Well, they've passed motions this week, both those councils, resolutions requiring that there be kept a register of social media interests of each councillor. So councillors must declare if they or their partner manages any community social media. So this is, as you say, the scenario where there's the Facebook community page that perhaps unbeknown to others, or perhaps not so transparent, is that it's being administered or managed by a councillor or their spouse. That allows that councillor potentially to, I guess, secretly kind of manipulate some of the stories, remove stories that are unfavourable to that councillor, only have stories that favour their position, maybe, be promoting stories that are contrary to some group in council, maybe banning people from commenting that they don't agree with. So this is all in the interest of transparency. There's not a ban on the councillors managing or administering these community social media pages, but they need to be transparent and include them in this register. I think it's a good. My thoughts are it's a good thing adding to the transparency for the reasons I've said. But how do we enforce this? Who's who's the police on the beat here? Who's gonna go around and find out? And what are the implications for failing to include this on the register? But I think it's an interesting move, and one that councils are being forced to consider in terms of the impact of these community Facebook and other social media pages that are being sort of controlled by political interests.
Yeah, it would be curious to me that two councils have done this at the same time. And they don't appear to have any links, the City of Bayswater and the town of Cambridge, and I wonder whether this is just the start of something, particularly in that Perth local government sector. Perhaps one to keep an eye on. I wasn't going to do a pick of the week, but I did come across a story just before we came on this morning that I think is worthy of mention. I'll cover this a bit more in the roundup on the weekend. Kiama Municipal Council in New South Wales has voted to support the Voice to Parliament. But one of its councillors voted against that and put out their own press release doing some scaremongering about signage, sort of suggesting that if anybody puts up yes or no signs, that they'd be fined and they'd be in breach of election laws. The Mayor of Kiama has had to take the extraordinary step of putting out a statement to say this councillor does not speak for the council, he's not authorised, and he's also wrong. That referendum advertising and signage is not covered by normal election signage, and tried to hose down that situation. So in light of that arbiter's decision about media policy, etc., that we were talking about earlier, there's perhaps a bit of a case study building there in Kiama that people might want to have a look at. All right, Tony, Julie, I think we've reached the end of another bumper issue, and I want to thank you both again for your insights and being part of TGU.
Well,
Thanks very
always
much.
a pleasure.
And I will just plug again that there is a special edition of VLGA Connect coming next week, where we will unpack in great detail the implications of the Operation Sandon report for the local government sector. Keep an eye on your social media feeds for news of that episode. I think it'll be around Monday night, maybe Tuesday, that we might be able to get that to you. In the meantime, thanks for listening and watching, and we'll see you again very soon for more from VLGA Connect.